All right. Okay. So at this point, we're going to transition to thinking about neurobiology from a uh, sort of in integrating the emotional regulation from also thinking about sensory processing, executive function, motor planning, the physical capacities of the individual. And this is just a schema that highlights that the different pathways to that end up in an acute crisis on the bottom. So this can happen with an individual with autism, intellectual disability, ADHD, language impairment, and anxiety. And these are the youth that you commonly interface or will need assistance with through this program. So one particular avenue is that the youth doesn't have a functional communication system. They become frustrated. This adds stress to the family. And if the family's not sure how to manage the communication needs, it leads to challenges in the interactions between the family members. Also, if there's a lack of communication or support with supports at home as well as the school, people are using different strategies that can be confusing for the youth and the family. And then there's underdeveloped coping skills. So again, this can lead to high frequency, intensity, and aggression, and self-injurious behaviors. So that's one route. The other is training of the providers with these types of youth with these profiles. One route is that they're misdiagnosed or undiagnosed with the behavioral health diagnosis. So Sue and I have been on an interdisciplinary team with a child psychiatrist where we have been doing this weekly for actually 8 years. And we are commonly helping to provide diagnostic clarification for these youth, and often including diagnoses of ADHD and anxiety, and also clarifying the cognitive level. We commonly see, I would say, almost every evaluation, the strategies and the language being used for the youth are above their developmental level. So we'll talk more about that. And then appropriate prescribing and if it's not appropriate, can lead to agitation and again, this crisis cycle. Another pathway is unrecognized sensory needs. So as you saw in the diagnosis, for autism, there are hypo or hyper sensitivities depending on the person's profile, and also those can get exacerbated when you're in an elevated state from a neurophysiological perspective. And also looking at what kind of care are they getting, kind of support they're getting. And also you can see, depending, this is specific to staff, you often see staff are changing in the home and also changes in the school. So if this sort of scenario is happening, again, it leads to a crisis. So an example here is that you're going into the house and the child's having a meltdown. Your goals are to support the regulation of the child. So I'm not saying anything you don't know, but this is how we're sort of wanting to sort of bridge what we're sharing with your role and your responsibilities to help support the regulation of the parents and the caregivers, to support your own regulation, and to help find out why the child is having a meltdown and to get the family and you help. And also as an occupational therapist, and you know this, that each of us will interact differently with the youth, and how do we each find a way that works for our interaction with that child. So one of the tools that I use commonly in practice, and just find it again as another tool, is the stress model. You may be familiar with the 5-point scale, and there's the woman who developed this actually had included this in some of her training, and I've just expanded on it. And we commonly think about, the stress cycle. This is a model scale of 1 to 5 going up, and then 5 to 1 recovering. So I'm going to actually, apparently, I'm going to annotate for you, and we're going to use green. And I'm going to move this down so it's not your way. So what we we will help identify when I'm evaluating, observing a child, I will sort of think, what's the behavior that's at a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5. So what's this process look like when they're getting to this point of extreme dysregulation? And also then, what does their recovery process look like? And also just to highlight that any emotion can be a 5. You can be happy, or you can be feeling silly. Often silly is assumed to be intentional, but you can be dysregulated in a silly state. So you can be mad. This is the common one, the anger, but also this is you're scared. This is anxiety, and this can be depression as well as anxiety. So you might the youth will present in different ways. And then I'm just going to quick. And one of the things that we find is that parents will say, oh, the youth goes from 0 to 100. And I'm going to just quickly clear my drawings. And actually, as we start to examine, it's actually the child's baseline is a 3. This is pretty common. So when they get to a 3, if you add a little bit more stimulation, it takes them to a 4. And then quickly you can get to a 5. And if you assume, if you're already elevated, you're really not at a 1. What happens is if you then get to this state up here, you're in a 5, and really at a 5, it's really about safety and love and really compassion and empathy for this person who's really struggling, and then also the family members. Is that what's really key is to make sure you understand the person's signs, and wait, you have to get to a 2 and a 1 before you can really engage in them. What we find is, especially with youth who communicate verbally, they might be talking, but they're really physiologically at a 4 and a 4 and a 5. And what happens is the interaction just sort of stays going on in this level. So what we want to do is understand what the behaviors look like at each of these levels, because the way we look like when we're escalating is very different than when we're recovering, every single one of us. And these inside lines are to indicate, what are some of the strategies that are used. And sometimes the way we look and what someone's doing at a certain level might be working really hard to keep themselves regulated. And in this bottom box is where you can identify a trigger. All right. So this is a really helpful tool. Whoops, I'm just trying to get out of this. All right, let me hide the floating controls. In this slide, I won't go into a lot of detail, but this is really describing the expectation. So this arrow is pointing to, this is the adults are working very hard to stay regulated while the child may be in a dysregulated state. The other piece that's really important to talk about in this conversation is trauma. And trauma can, really be related to different experiences. It's very common that youth with intellectual disabilities and autism are mistreated. And then mistreatment can be including the way they're spoken to, the way they're physically handled, and to think about the types of restraints that they experience. And how do we account for that and understand that when they're really in a crisis? So it's really important, and this is something I know you are trained in, and it helps how we can really apply and think about trauma related to how the brain functions. So really, if you think about the stress cycle, when you get above a 3, hitting the 4 and the 5, this is where the prefrontal cortex is offline. So it's so key, and I do a tremendous amount of training and educating of family members and other providers to say, you think the person's with you when you're in that elevated state, and they're not. And so the goal is regulation, and how do we work to keep them regulated so that they can use that part of their brain for impulse control, working memory, cognitive flexibility, all these skills that are needed. And so we're going to, I think I'll stop there. So this is to just, again, a schema for the stress process. The alarm goes off, the brain is activated. You see this little map is to show like a lot of activity going on in the brain, and that the prefrontal cortex and frontal lobe is not functioning effectively. At times the person might have the capacity, and then you think, how come they're not using it? But they physiologically can't. And the important thing here is to be thinking more objectively versus assigning something to the youth's understanding and presentation of what's going on. So the other is with trauma responses, they can be the response can be very adaptive and protective in the threatening situation. So they may have challenges with bodily functions or maladaptive behaviors. And when trauma is not observed in the context of, or when the behavior is not observed within the context of past traumas, brain function, and developmental level, the behaviors can be misinterpreted. In fact, we did an evaluation of a youth a couple of weeks ago where he is definitely experiencing trauma, and the mother, when she gets frustrated, she sort of squeezes him and digs her nails into his arms, and she's like, this is, I don't know what to do, so this is what I do. And at the same time she says he doesn't like touch. And so and he has a diagnosis of autism, so is he sensitive to touch as a baseline neurobiology, and or is he sensitive to touch because when his mother gets frustrated with him, she squeezes him and puts fingers in his, and you wouldn't want to be touched if someone is treating you that way. So these are really important concepts to understand. And the other point is that the body matters. So we live and move through the world in our bodies. And just as Sue was talking about in terms of understanding language and how that gets expressed, that also gets expressed through how we manipulate materials. So we need to understand that we have ideas, and then we use our body to express them. And the concepts that I'll explain this a little bit more in terms of concepts related to physical capacities of people. The other piece from a trauma perspective is that the body holds the memories, the good and the bad. And also this needs to be addressed. So you may have heard this in your practice as the issues are in our tissues. So children, your body remembers when you have had a positive experience, something feels good, or if something doesn't feel good. And so if they sort of have a reaction physically, that may be related to trauma. It could be related to a sensory sensitivity, and that needs to be evaluated so that you treat the cause, not the symptom. And this is a great slide that really talks about response to trauma and how it impacts bodily function. So you are going to be, doing your assessments of this. How well is the child sleeping? So if their reticular activating system is overactive, they may have difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, might have nightmares. Also, they can have challenges with eating. You might see rapid eating. Lack of satiation, food hoarding, loss of appetite, and then toileting. We constantly may or may not be related to trauma. It could be related to some other GI issues, as constipation is common with people with autism. And also when there's an intellectual challenge or communication challenges, they may not have the words to say, I'm constipated. Also many of them have a restricted diet. And so their behavior may be linked to their bodily function, not that they're upset about something specific in the environment. So really understanding sort of, again, the brain-body connection in these ways as well. So I'm going to talk about sensory processing disorders. So there's a classification system that was proposed in occupational therapy a number of years ago. And I'm going to share two of the three areas. One is sensory modulation disorder. And this is what we commonly think when someone says it's sensory. We think it's like a sensitivity or an over responsiveness or an under responsiveness to a sensation or seeking. The other that's important is to think there are what's called sensory-based motor disorders. And these are classified by dyspraxia and postural disorders. And so I'm just realizing, I'm going to keep going. So, so there's dyspraxia is the concept of related, the definition that is that you have an sort of the underlying praxis for an experience. So you have the idea, and then you can actually know how to plan your body to perform an activity. The other is postural disorder, and these are what's common where children have low muscle tone and they don't have the muscle strength or control to conduct uh, a particular motor act. And it's important to tease out when a child has postural control issues or motor planning, and they can exist together or they can be separate presentations. So I'm going to switch to Sue at this time.
Thanks, Mary Beth. As a part of this presentation and the PowerPoint handout, you will also have available an emotional regulation strategy handout. And this is something that Mary Beth and I put together really for your sake in terms of all the different ways that youth benefit depending upon their profile of different kinds of emotional regulation strategies. So it's not critical that you have this as we go forward, but I wanted you to know that it's available and is classified in terms of the kind of strategies that one can use and help another person, and then strategies that are used, such as learning supports. So why don't we go ahead and go to the next slide, and we'll dig a little deeper into these. Oh, okay. So one of the things that will really just one of the take home points is remembering that of all the mutual regulation strategies and the self-regulation strategies, these are some of the things, the quick tips. One way that we want when we're coming into the house is perhaps thinking about adjusting your voice. It's not necessary all the time. Just take a look at, scope out the social environment. And it is amazing how by using a slower speech rate, a softer volume, a lower pitch, that can do so much in terms of reduce the tension in the room, just even slowing one's speech rate down. So that's one example. Next, as Mary Beth had mentioned, using language that matches the child, the youth's developmental level. And to understand what is the child's developmental level, this is part of the information that you're hopefully going to be gathering during the intake process, where there might be an IEP, but to really understand the level of language that the child is using so that you're not speaking over the child or under the child in terms of developmental level. So one of the things that you may consider doing is inserting pauses into your speech to give the youth some additional time to process information. I know I speak very, very quickly, especially if I'm stressed. And being able to say a sentence or a phrase and give the individual time to process what is being said can go a long way. So these are simple interpersonal adjustments that you can make that can make a world of difference. Less is more. the more dysregulated the individual is, the less language you want to use. There are times when I will come into a therapy room, see how stressed the youth is. I know that the youth perhaps is uses language. So instead of talking, I might just start writing and talk and writing, communicating to the individual um, by by just a piece of paper and a pencil. Being able to see what someone is communicating can be so helpful and perhaps more helpful than adding more stress by talking. If you're going into a situation that is kind of the heat of the moment, it may be important to adjust the number of people that are in the room to make sure that there is a lot of interpersonal space or less interpersonal space between and among the youth, staff, and the family. And all of this is in service of regulating the youth and those around him or her.
Oops.
So these are just a few of the kinds of learning supports that might be helpful for individuals. The emotion topic board is something that I find useful to use when I know that the child has an understanding of certain emotions, has the words, is using symbols, may be able to read, but at least be able to recognize the facial expressions, uh, and to really begin to model for the child, um, match what their own emotional state is and labeling it. Just as we read to children so that they learn to read, we read the emotions of the child so they are able to begin to read and recognize them themselves. So this is an example of a visual support that reflects 3 different developmental areas or domains. And it really is an example to make the point that the visual support really has to be um, at the child's developmental level. So for children that are not at a symbolic system, we might consider using objects to be able, if to be able to help the child understand what is going to happen next. We might have a picture, or we might have a diaper, and we might have a cup, and we might be saying first diaper, then cup. We might have a schedule that has I'll stop there and I'll just go on to early symbolic because I realize there are some other supports that will reiterate some of the pre-symbolic points I wanted to make. So an early symbolic user of language will be able to read words. They might be able to, they'll recognize a picture. They'll recognize gestures. They might they will recognize certain signs or words. So you would want to match your visual support to the, again, the developmental level of the child who was at an early symbolic stage. And then we have individuals who are language users and are symbolic in their communication. So they are able to uh, read and process written text. They're able to understand speech. So the 3 levels are important to keep in mind when working with individuals so that your language level and your way of communicating is developmentally appropriate, and that the supports that you use are also developmentally appropriate. Next. So for a pre-symbolic communicator, a person, maybe a youth who has a severe intellectual developmental disability, we might consider using an object-based schedule. This is to promote an understanding of time, an understanding of the day for the individual, to facilitate putting them at ease so that they know what's going to happen next. First, there is toileting. Then you are going to take a shower. And so these objects, concrete objects, represent different daily events in the youth's day, which provides them a sense of order, a sense of what's going to be happening next, all in service of trying to support the emotional regulation of a communication partner who's at the pre-symbolic stage of development. Other kinds of visual supports or learning supports will provide time information. What am I doing today? The daily schedule, we all use one. It may be one of pictures, it might be one of words, it might be one on our phones. Again, this particular visual support is for an individual who's at an emerging reader. So the pictures are still there, but the words are also there. And over time, the words will be, or the pictures may be faded, where it will just be the words. But I will just make one quick point that when individuals are in a stressful state, 4 and 5s on the stress cycle, what they're able to process when they are regulated is not always the same thing they can process when they are dysregulated. So there are often times when I know children can read, but I will use choice boards that have pictures, because when they are at the heat of the moment, it's going to be helpful for them to be able to actually see what they need to do and see it in the picture versus taxing the cognitive system anymore and having them read. Next. And these are additional learning supports that monitor time. And also learning supports that can help individuals with a procedure. What are the steps to something? This is an example of washing hands with the words and the pictures. We also use recipes when in terms of learning how to do something. These are examples for a young reader to begin just helping them move through a procedure to a end product. Okay. I think that's yours, Mary Beth.
Yep,
Okay.
I'm switching out
There's
the
Robert.
view.
No worries.
Great. So the remainder of the slides are just giving you suggestions of tools for your toolbox. And you may have many of these and be aware of many of these, but we'll just be highlighting some that you can have available and consider. One, and sort of continue on along the lines of learning supports, or really looking at the auditory system. There are actually a number of studies that have done brain scans of people with autism, and it does show there's evidence of, on average, they have a higher sensitivity to sound. So what they're reporting is valid. So one of the things is decreasing auditory input. And just as Sue was saying, is our voice is auditory input, it's sound. So it's a powerful tool, is how you adjust what you say, how you say it, in service of regulation and learning and social relationships. So this is a great place to start. Also removing the person from the noisy environments if something is upsetting to them, especially again, if you are elevated and you get more of a stimulation that's stressful to you, it's going to take you up to the next level and be really hard to access your frontal cortex to help regulate yourself. And then adjusting the type and amount of communication that match the level of arousal. So the more they go up, the less, the less words and the softer the voice is typically needed. And again, using language at the person's developmental level, both language and cognition. So here are examples of earbuds, headphones, and different kinds of earbuds that are available to explore. In addition to the auditory sensitivity, we're aware that kids don't necessarily like things in their ear, but some of them like certain textures over. Some of them might want something soft versus wanting something harder, or headphones. And also you can work often with the BCBA around developing a program for wearing something to protect their ears and the auditory sensitivity. This is very common. The other is weighted materials. And what I'm listing too with each of these is the actual sensory system that's associated with these tools. So when someone says it's sensory, what we first want to do is, which sensory systems are we talking about? We have a number of them. So we talked about auditory, but there's the tactile, the touch, and proprioception, which is, proprioception gives you the feedback of where you are in space and how you move your body in space. So you're probably familiar with weighted materials. So these are some weighted mats, a weighted blanket. If families don't have weighted blankets, or the resources sometimes will take, you can take a pillow cover or a duvet cover and put more blankets in it and figure out what weight is helpful for that particular individual. It doesn't have to be a really expensive item. You can create strategies or weighted materials that are low cost and effective. And these next two slides are really thinking about activities that engage in heavy work that help regulate the body and help focus the youth. So, and these are really nice ways. So if you're in the home, helping the child carry groceries, moving and pushing things, making their bed, sweeping. We have kids help with chores, with laundry. So these are just examples of different things where they're using their upper body, they're getting some weight, it's helping to calm and focus them. And again, you want to do this when they're regulated, but these are activities that can be woven throughout the day that help engage the child in a meaningful, purposeful way. Or if you start to see that they're getting dysregulated, you might want to come up with a chore or an activity that they enjoy. A lot of kids like washing the car, so there's different kinds of things that they can do. Now, washing the cars may not be the easiest activity to integrate into the day, but you get the point. Other lists are pushing chairs and pushing and pulling, and will often engage in activities that require heavy input. Again, I mentioned stuffing pillowcases and duvets with pillows and blankets. So these are, and also having pets. Pets can be a lot of children benefit from having a cat or a dog that allows them to get that input and that pressure and sort of the warmth from the pet in terms of regulating. The other sensory system that's sort of really a combination of sensory systems, but a strategy is oral motor. So there's touch, there's tactile, there's proprioception, there's olfactory, gustatory. So there's lots of different sensory systems involved, but oral motor strategies, like Sue mentioned, chewing gum is one that's common that some adults and children use. Here are some other examples of sucking on a straw. I mean, it's interesting in our culture now, the amount of us that walk around with water bottles and take sips and may not be aware of how much those sips, in addition to hydration, is also helping to have a calming. As infants, we start by regulating ourselves from an oral motor perspective. And then crunchy. Here are hard foods that can often be given as snacks that are also regulating for youth. And then in school, sometimes they'll have things on the ends of pencils that the kids can chew, or a chewing necklace. So you want to assess what are they seeking? And again, thinking in me, I'm thinking as an OT, as Match.com, you want to choose the tool that matches the need. And this slide has a number of different regulating activities that you can think about that are providing both using the hands, but also the whole body. So over here, belly breath, wall sits, deep breaths, and wall push-ups. You may have heard some of these and familiar. The other is when you're in a flexed position, as this young boy is, either on your back or prone, is a more calming position than when your arms and legs are extended away from your body. When you move your arms away from your body, that's a more alerting to your nervous system. So coming into a flex position. Also, some youth really love having pressure on their back, as this little girl is, or rolling a ball and pushing it up and down a wall can be regulating, and also they're getting some of the pressure they're seeking through their upper body. Hanging is another one. Some parents will put bars between, like a hanging bar between a door and a doorway, to prevent kids from climbing, but they get to hang and climb, and that traction through the arms can be calming. We also have writing or drawing. Some kids love mandalas. And then here's just a box of lots of fidgets, and then modeling clay. Modeling clay is, I showed these small packages. We use them a lot because it's a small package. It's easier and not as messy as Play-Doh, and you can put it in a little Ziploc bag and give it to the child and the family to use. And then the other piece is, if children have low muscle tone or motor control or motor coordination problems, often, or seeking pressure for calming their body, is to think about different seating options. Here are bean bags. I showed two where they're sort of sitting reading, but this one is showing how the support is really coming up around the shoulder and the head. The other is, I find I ran a summer camp for kids with autism, and each child in certain groups would have their own beach chair, and these, you can get at CVS for $10 with a coupon. I know we all have coupons at CVS. And this is where the child has their own space and they can sit and be supported and is low and safe. And then also thinking about where in the couch kids like to sit, putting them in the corner, leaning them against the floor. These others are, this is sort of an interesting picture I found, but there are ways that being upside down when you're in an inverted position, it can be calming. But I really wanted to point out, often I'll encourage parents to have their child sit in the corner or have their back against to get support. And then these are versions of when, if the child is often at the dining room table, what I find is their child's feet are hanging and they're wiggling. And if they have ADHD or low muscle tone, they're quite dysregulated. You put them in a seat where their feet are supported, or you have them in a table with the chair of the right height, ergonomics for children. Often that is the secret, and they just need more physical support to be able to use their hands and participate during mealtime. So in summary, the things that we have been sharing and want to just reinforce is that often we see what we think is, what we have seen in practice is that's often overlooked or unappreciated. Really, again, thinking about the developmental level of the youth and what language strategies are at their aptitude or capacity, and thinking about aptitude and capacity based on their level of arousal. So if they're dysregulated, even simplify it more. And if they're regulated, you can use more, optimize the strategies you're using. Processing speed, very commonly, when they have neuropsych testing, their processing speed is found to be slow, so they need more time. And we provide a lot of information quickly, so we want to slow what we're saying and give more wait time. Often I'll count on my fingers, I'll say something and then I'll count and to assess. So how many seconds does it take for the youth to respond? before I say something again. Give them the chance to respond. Again, thinking about the types of supports needed for success, give less support. Sometimes less is more, so they need time to process everything that's coming at them. You also want to think about that if they're engaging in repetitive and sensory behaviors, they may be using them to regulate. And how do we sort of shape that and understand that better? The other, we talked about the body matters. So looking at motor planning and executive function challenges. What are they trying to do? Some youth get upset because they can't figure out how to use their body or move things around or coordinate themselves. So then they get upset and we end up focusing on the behavior, not what they were trying to do. So if we help them be successful with what they're trying to do, you're less likely to have a behavioral reaction to that challenge. We also really want to understand the why behind the behavior. And then again, thinking about sensory processing, their sensitivities and seekings, and what's sort of the neurophysiological benefit of those behaviors, whether it's overstimulation or helping to regulate. And the same sensation might be both regulating at one point and can be overstimulating others. So you really, this is where it's important to understand that individual. These are a list of our references. I'll leave them up for a moment so that, and you can also, you'll be able to come back and uh, look at this. If you slow down your video, you can refer to these references. And I think that is it. And I'll have Sue come back on. And so we want to thank you for your attention. We hope this presentation was helpful. Any final words, Sue?
No, we're delighted to have been able to tell you a little bit about what speech pathologists and occupational therapists offer the team, and you are on the front line, and however we can support you in the work you do, we really want to make sure we're available to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.